Okay. So good morning, good morning. Hi everyone. Welcome again to one of our Connect University session, part of the autumn school dedicated to digital strategies on an international level. We're going beyond European borders, trying to understand better what the EU is doing in terms of digital. We tried and build for you as many sessions as we could from different angles. Yesterday we had on AI and also ones on partnerships in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today we are going to take a slightly different angle. Now, the session of today will explore practically how digital trade policy supports EU's external digital engagement. What you might expect to hear from us today is a broad view of what digital trade is, the key digital trade disciplines, how we plan to overcome barriers to digital trade, how we are promoting tools to facilitate digital trade and foster consumer trust online. And lastly, we will go, especially for those of you who followed yesterday and seem to be interested in it, we will go today over some of the instruments. So some of the digital trade and free trade agreements, the multilateral instruments, and so on. For this, I am here only to warm things up and be, let's say, your voice. We have with us today Monica Cunningham from Digitrade. She's a member of the Digital Trade and Negotiations team, so she will be the one guiding us today. In terms of logistics, before we actually start, remember you can always ask your questions here in Slido. Then I will make sure that they reach their way towards the speaker. We will try making it as conversational as possible. At the same time, for those of you who cannot stay until the end, the session of today will be recorded and it will appear on the Digital EU YouTube channel, and the slides will appear on Futurum. So I make sure to leave links for this in the chat. So without further ado, Monica, please take us through things.
Good morning. Thank you so much. So looking forward to speaking to you this morning about the European Commission's digital trade policy. And to assist with clarity, I have prepared some slides, which I'll now share with you. So. Here we go. So this is the introductory slide for the Connect University session on. But what we also have is obviously we have a situation where we have a number of free trade agreements that were agreed before digital trade chapter disciplines, if you like, were developed. And with respect to those, and I'm thinking in particular Korea, Singapore, what we've done is we've negotiated digital trade agreements that complement the original free trade agreement, which didn't include a modern digital trade chapter. So if you like, our digital trade agreements are complements to pre-existing free trade agreements. But we're working on a number, and I'll go into this a little bit. You know, there are a number of different tools in which we further our digital trade objectives. And I'll go in a little bit later in the presentation to sort of explain how we do this on a bilateral and a plurilateral, multilateral basis. Great, thank you so much, Alex. That's really good to see. Maybe you could just pop back to the previous slide just so that people could sort of have a quick look at the list that I discussed. Yeah, and there we are. That was just the sort of, I was going over, if you like, and apologies for doing that without you being able to see the text. But I was just going over a little bit the different types of goods and services and the different ways in which commercial activity is affected by data flows, electronic tools, and consequently fall within the scope, if you like, of our digital trade disciplines. Right, so moving to the next one. And this, as I was saying, this breadth, if you like, of applicability, and the way in which digital technologies are transforming every aspect of the economy, really, has resulted in considerable difficulty, if you like, in measuring the impact of digital trade. It's not as easy as measuring goods as they go across a border. And so it's the OECD has done a lot of good work in this regard. And they have, in fact, have published a handbook on measuring digital trade. And so what you'll see here is that it's a little bit of an interesting distinction in the first place between, on the one hand, digital trade and non-monetary digital flows, which themselves, within, say, intra-company transfer of data isn't in itself a monetary flow and isn't going to be appear in statistics. But of course, it's incredibly important that those digital flows can take place. And that, as I mentioned previously, the monetary flows, the data flows between, say, a product produced by a company and the parent company could be incredibly important in ensuring that the product continues to function effectively, and in ensuring that the company who's produced the product can continue to develop that product and improve it for the benefit of consumers. But those digital flows aren't necessarily going to be caught by our trade statistics. So they're not going to, if you like, contribute to measuring the importance of digital trade. And then when we look at the digital trade sort of more conventionally, what you can see there is a little bit of a sort of an overlap. So you've got the role here that's highlighted as well is of the digital intermediation platforms. And I think that's an important factor as well when looking at these statistics, is the extent to which this digital trade is enabled by these intermediation platforms. And then you've got the three categories, which are which I mentioned earlier, which is whether we're talking about a good or service that's been ordered digitally, one that's been both ordered and delivered digitally, and then finally purely digitally delivered. And then, of course, goods and services. So I think that's just a helpful. And then there's a column on the right which shows who all the different actors are. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's not necessarily as sort of limited as maybe in traditional trade. I think here we have a number of additional actors who also are party to this ecosystem, if you like, of digital trade. So I think that's quite useful just to sort of bear in mind. If we move to the next slide. Thanks for that. So so as you can imagine, in recent years, the importance of digital trade has grown exponentially. I think what we're looking at now in terms of the more recent figures is we're looking at over 60% of global GDP being linked to digital transactions in one way or another. And the global value of e-commerce reached 26 trillion in 2022, an increase of 10% from 2021. So hugely important. From the perspective of the EU, I think it's important to note that the EU is particularly strong, in fact, in digitally deliverable services. This includes financial services, insurance services, telecommunications, and computer and information services. 54% of all EU services trade are digitally delivered. So I think that's, as you see, something that's incredibly important and of increasing importance. And as I've mentioned, trusted cross-border data flows underpin all of this. And if we're going to be forward-looking, I've talked about what we have already, and when we look going forward, I think the importance of cross-border data flows are only going to be enhanced as Internet of Things expand, but also as AI expands, because of course data flows underpin absolutely the provision of AI services. So I think that's something that's it's not going to go away is the point. I'm sure we all expect that. So moving to the next slide. And this is just an example. And if you just click again, you'll see what pops up. There you are. So this is a little bit what I touched upon earlier, is that, you know, you think you're just trading in a traditional good, but in fact, even the trading in the most traditional industrial product, if you like, these days includes, you know, very significant digital trade component. So possibly moving to the next slide. But what we're seeing in this world is, while we're seeing on the one hand this incredibly, you know, increase in the importance of digital trade and the increasing importance of data flows, we're also seeing that in fact the regulatory landscape, probably unsurprisingly, but is becoming increasingly restrictive as these services developed. The OECD again has done some very good work on digital services trade restrictiveness. And they've pinpointed that there are in fact great variations across different regions in terms of the impact of regulation and domestic legislation. They saw that initially the sort of largest restrictiveness was in Africa, and the lowest restrictiveness was in fact in OECD countries. But we're seeing overall that there's, in OECD countries in particular, there's an increase in the level of restrictiveness of, or the level of restrictions arising, if you like, from domestic legislation. Then, so I see a question here. Yep, I'll come to that when we talk about. So do remind me. I'll come to that question when we come to the point about digital trade agreements. So I think that the important thing here to remind. I mean, so listen. The thing about the development of restrictiveness, of course, is it's linked to, I think, increasing concerns regarding the impact of, for instance, sharing data. So I'm not saying that this is all bad. Obviously, you know, a lot of our regulation in particular, I think, is very, very useful and very necessary. But of course, it is having an impact on digital trade. And I think from that perspective, I think what's interesting, and we'll come to that, is how we reflect this in our digital trade rules. You know, the need, how we reflect the balance between the need for regulation and, on the other hand, the need to ensure that digital trade can continue and grow. Obviously, digital barriers, you know, another aspect of looking at digital barrier isn't just the rise of regulation, it's also the lack of digitalization. And I think that's something that's very important. And this is maybe also where the reference to Africa in the OECD report comes up, which is a lack of digitalization, of course, affects the ability of actors on the ground to take part in digital trade. And the lack of digital tools, if you like, raises the overall cost of doing trade. And limits firms' ability to participate in digital trade on a regional or global basis. So moving then to the next slide. So I think what's interesting here is, and this comes from, just as we're talking about the sort of regulatory approaches to digital trade, which, as I said, is balanced a little bit with the objectives of digital trade. I think there's an author, Anu Bradford, who you've probably heard of, who was a very well-known author of a book on the Brussels effect about regulation. And she published a book last year talking about the worldwide impact of you know, different policy approaches across the EU, the US, and China. And I think this is just interesting to sort of, you know, for us to sort of look at the global picture of how this is all developing. And of course, in the middle, we have what we in the EU refer to as our human-centric approach. And I think very much the EU is seen as being at the forefront of a lot of policy development and regulation in the digital sphere. And I'm sure you're hearing a lot about that from different speakers in this context. And famously in that context, we're starting with the GDPR, and I'll come to how that's reflected in our digital trade rules later. By contrast, the US approach has traditionally been to focus less on regulation, but more let business determine the rules of the game. And on the other hand, China has had a more significant focus on a state-driven regulatory model. And so I think this is an interesting background, if you like, or an interesting way of seeing the background to digital trade. Moving to the next slide. Right, so here we get to a little bit of a history of nope, going back to the timeline. Thanks very much. So this is a little bit of a history of how digital trade rules have developed. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in the following slides about the different types of agreement that we have in the EU, for instance. So I think what we're looking left-hand side, about 1998, is really when the issue of digital trade first came to the WTO. And the WTO actually took a very significant step in 1998, and there was a ministerial decision that WTO members would not impose customs duties on electronic transmissions. And this is something which I think is absolutely foundational in terms of the development of digital trade worldwide. You know, I think it's meant that anybody delivering software online, people delivering content online, have not been subject to customs duties. Now, you might say, well, yes, but I mean, how would countries have actually imposed customs duties on those services which are delivered online? Good point. That's something that we can maybe discuss a little bit later as well. But nonetheless, I think it was a very you know, with respect to the fact of whether it would have been possible anyhow, I think it was very forward-looking to actually take that decision publicly, and to, if you like, give business the confidence to know that they could move forward with this type of service without risk of customs duties. I mean, it isn't a permanent commitment. It's a commitment that's been renewed every 2 years at the ministerial conferences that have taken place since. But okay, we'll come to that. In 2015, the EU pushed to prepare the first e-commerce chapter in the context of the TTIP and TISA negotiations. There about 2016, we had the first EU self-standing digital trade chapter, if you like, within an EU free trade agreement. 2017, I think there was the first start of exploratory talks on more broader digital trade rules within the WTO, although you'll see that the political launch of the WTO e-commerce negotiations wasn't until 2019. In the meantime, for the EU perspective, there was a very important step, which was that in 2018, the Commission was able to reach a position on determining how we should approach rules on data flows and how we need to balance those with the need to ensure the protection of personal data. So for us, that's really a key moment where we were then able to sort of take forward our fully blown, if you like, digital trade chapter in our free trade agreements. But maybe let's move to the next slide, and then I can we'll come over these different steps in more detail in the next. So here we have a little bit of our, so as I said, we started a little bit with having some less detailed provisions on e-commerce in our free trade agreements as of the Korea, Singapore, Vietnam agreements. And then it wasn't until the Japan agreement that we really had what we called a separate chapter that wasn't in the services chapter, but a separate chapter called digital trade. And I think it's fair to say that our most modern digital trade chapter, our current digital trade chapter, that is the most, closest to what we are currently submitting in negotiations, is the UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement in 2020. Can I just go back to that question that I was asked a little bit ago? Would you mind putting that back up on the screen, Alex?
Yes. You can see it still in the chat.
It's been in the chat. Sorry.
I would read it, but honestly, it has so many acronyms that don't want to mess it up. So
Yeah, I got to say, I'm sure it's the same in many, many sectors, but acronyms are the bane of my life. So it's always difficult to follow them, isn't it? So the question is, when do we conclude digital trade agreements versus digital trade chapters in PTAs? I'm assuming we mean free trade agreements for PTAs. Yeah, so exactly. I think I touched upon this earlier. So essentially, the digital trade agreements that we have normally nowadays, we submit a digital trade chapter in the context of our newly opened or newly reopened free trade negotiations. We do have these separate digital trade agreements with Korea, Singapore, where we have indeed, if you like, concluded a self-standing, well, it's not entirely self-standing, an agreement which is a separate agreement called a digital trade agreement, but it is linked to the previous FTAs that were concluded with those countries. So it's not entirely self-standing. In terms of that they seem more comprehensive, I would say that while I'm saying that we have core disciplines, I think it's fair to say that each agreement has a slightly different scope. And that's normal, of course, because that depends on the partner with whom we're negotiating and what they want to include, and also possibly the different economies that we're negotiating with. So I would say that any digital trade chapter or digital trade agreement won't necessarily have exactly the same scope in terms of the disciplines. I think you'll find all the core disciplines there, but they won't all have exactly the same scope. And then what I've mentioned here at the bottom of this slide on our practice is, well, so first I should probably say that obviously you're aware that we're under the chapter digital trade chapter. Many of those agreements are currently being negotiated, and I think we can actually add Malaysia to that list and the UAE to the list of free trade agreements that are currently being negotiated. So just to say, Malaysia and UAE should be added to that list. And then finally, what I've got mentioned there is the WTO e-commerce agreement. Now, this is interesting because all the other items that I have on that list are obviously bilateral agreements or negotiations between the EU and those countries. And the WTO e-commerce agreement, as I said, was launched in 2019, not amongst all WTO members, but be amongst 91 WTO members. Well, it ended up being negotiated amongst 91 WTO members who saw the need to have a baseline of digital trade disciplines that would underpin digital trade worldwide. And I will come to a little bit more detail, the content of that and a little bit the history and what's happening with that. It's an agreement that, but just to flag now, it's an agreement that has been negotiated and that we are currently in the process of seeing whether this can be incorporated into the body of WTO rules. Right, next slide, please. Right, so this is getting to the sort of core of the matter, which is, well, what do our digital trade rules actually contain? And I mean, essentially, our digital trade rules have three main aims. Starting with number 3, they aim to improve online trust for consumers. I mean, maybe the first thing I should say is that, and this is probably obvious from what I said about the way digital trade rules cut across all sectors of the economy and cut across all types of trade in goods, trade in services. Our digital trade chapters aren't about ensuring market access. They're essentially a regulatory chapter. And so what they try and do is to ensure that both parties to the agreement have rules in place that facilitate digital trade, that help promote digital trade, and also tackle unjustified barriers to digital trade. So removal of barriers to digital trade that aren't justified and facilitate digital trade. So within the sort of facilitation bucket, if you like, we've got measures to improve online trust for consumers. And here it's basically having commitments regarding parties committing to ensuring levels of consumer protection for individuals and companies that engage in digital trade. Sorry, it's actually individuals. The consumer protection article is really about individuals. We have an article regarding protection against unsolicited commercial communications, commonly known as spam. And obviously we have an article regarding the protection of personal data and privacy. And this one's very important, and I'll come back to it in the context of our article on data flows. But essentially, we have a carve out in our agreement allowing the EU and its partners to have their own rules on the protection of personal data. And this is very important for the EU because we regard the protection of personal data as a fundamental right. We also have a provision on a commitment to allow open internet access. And these are all things which allow, it favors, if you like, participation of consumers and individuals in digital trade. Secondly, more from a business perspective, we're about ensuring that there are rules in place that give legal certainty to business wanting to engage in digital trade. And here we have rules on, the acceptance of electronic contracts, so that it's not possible. It's not to say that electronic contracts, that we're not committing to allow electronic contracts in every single circumstance. Of course, there are circumstances under domestic legislation where electronic contracts aren't suitable, but broadly speaking, the idea is that outside those particular circumstances, that electronic contracts should be recognised and should be recognised by the courts of both parties. We have rules on electronic authentication and trust services. And this means basically electronic signatures, electronic seals, electronic registered delivery services, again, to sort of help foster comfort, if you like, with taking part in digital contracts. We have a provision for electronic invoices, and the aim there is to ensure that when a country develops an electronic invoicing system, that electronic invoicing system should be based on international standards and should promote interoperability between electronic invoicing systems. So what we're looking at there is to have, to have reciprocal commitments regarding the development of electronic invoicing systems that can function automatically. Electronic invoicing system. What is an electronic invoicing system? It's something where our invoices are machine readable, and that those machine readable invoices can be read by each other's systems. This is actually incredibly important in terms of reducing the cost of trading online, doing business online. We do sometimes, but not always, have a provision on paperless trading, which is on ensuring that customs, to the extent possible, customs processes can be done in a paperless fashion rather than necessarily producing old style papers in triplicate in order to get goods through the border. Finally, we also have a provision on open government data, because given the benefits of data, it's a commitment to, where the government so chooses to make government data open, that it should do the way in which it does so. And those are, I think, things which are all just very useful in terms of enabling businesses to take part in digital trade and giving consumers that extra level of trust that they know that there are systems in place for recourse in case something goes wrong if they take part in electronic commerce, for instance. Then I'll come to the other aspect, which is that what we look to do is to remove any unjustified barriers to trade. And there are different elements there, and I think I'll go in the following slides. I've mentioned already customs duties and electronic transmissions. So the prohibition on customs duties and electronic transmissions, which is part of the sort of WTO commitment that's renewed every 2 years, is a part of our digital trade disciplines in our free trade agreements. And I think that's a very important provision, that we have a reciprocal commitment not to impose customs duties on those electronic transmissions. And then I'll come in the next couple of slides into a bit more detail on the ban on data localization and on forced transfer of source code. So maybe we can move to the next slide. Great. So as discussed, data is really underpins all of the digital economy, and it's really of growing importance. So I've given, a number of examples previously, including the example of the car, but it's not just cars. It's also logistics. It's facilitating tracking a container as it moves across the world, or digital banking, for instance, which requires transfer of data across borders. So in this context, I mentioned the fact that we're seeing some more restrictions arising. Obviously, some of those restrictions are justified for regulatory reasons. But I think we've got to contrast a little bit the use of justified restrictions versus a temptation to move into data protectionism, where data is seen, it's sometimes described as the new oil, right? So I think there's a little bit of a view among some governments worldwide that, well, let's hold on to our data, let's not share it. But then the difficulty of having rules in place, of uncontrolled rules in place that prohibit the movement of data across borders, is, of course, that it makes participation in global value chains much more difficult, and it hinders, if you like, as I mentioned earlier, some of the benefits that we were seeing to a company being able to share the data from the goods that it's using. So it's affecting all sorts of types of trade and the provision of all sorts of types of services. So the way the EU has approached this is not to include in our digital trade agreement a general commitment to ensure the free flow of data. And in fact, that's the model which has been pursued, if you like, by the CPTPP countries, where they have a general commitment to ensure the free flow of data, but then they have exceptions to that on legitimate public policy grounds. Our approach has been a bit different, which is to say what we have a commitment not to have a certain limited list of restrictions or data localization requirements. And we associate this, but of course this is also subject to the general exceptions that underpin all free trade agreements. And we have a specific article regarding privacy. So if you like, our right to regulate the protection of personal data and privacy is carved out from the commitments regarding restrictions on data localization requirements. And this is very important from our perspective. Then moving on to the next slide, unless there are any questions on this to date. I'm just going to check that I haven't missed any particular. Yes, so preferential trade agreement, regional trade agreement, free trade agreement, those are all different terms which are used. And we typically use free trade agreements, so that's why I'm sticking to FTAs in this context, just for simplicity's sake. In just looking at the question here on the difference between customs duties and tariffs, we can come to that. I'm pretty sure they're pretty much the same thing, but I'm happy to be corrected if somebody has a different view, or if tariff has a specific meaning for you in that context. Right, I'm seeing a particular question about consumer protection. So DSA includes reinforced broader online marketplace provisions. Plans to update the template? No, we don't currently have any plans to update the template. Though I wouldn't say never. I think our the way I see it is that our body of consumer protection law is I think it's worth going into this a little bit because it is quite interesting. The way we've approached consumer protection law and the digital world, if you like, in the EU, my perception anyhow, is that we have always updated our general consumer protection legislation to take account of digital concerns. So in a way, it's not that we have a body of consumer protection law on the one hand, and then we have the Digital Services Act, for instance, on the other hand. I think what we're seeing is that we're seeing an evolution in our consumer protection legislation in the EU over time in order to meet the challenges of the digital world and participation in digital activities. And then on the other hand, of course, the Digital Services Act brings in additional provisions. But I don't know that our baseline consumer protection rules as set out in our free trade agreements necessarily needs to be changed in order to reflect the Digital Services Agreement. We can maybe come to the Digital Services Agreement in the context of the protection of source code, because that is one article here where indeed, because of the need for oversight of software systems, that is provided for in the context of our commitments on source code. So to go step back just a step, why do we have an article which precludes the mandatory disclosure of source code as a condition for importing or selling a good in a country? And the objective is to protect businesses against forced technology transfer that might occur when they enter into a new market. So the idea is, of course, countries have checks that can be done by conformity assessment bodies, for instance, to check that a product that's being put on the market in their country meets their standards and their safety requirements. But what we have seen is that in some cases, EU companies have been concerned that entering certain markets, they've been required to disclose source code, and that this essentially amounts to a forced technology transfer. So they might see subsequently that after the disclosure of their source code, that a local competitor suddenly comes up with a product which includes the source code material that they disclosed. So here the idea is to balance the need to protect the source code of a company that's maybe exporting, with the need that countries have, in order to ensure compliance with their domestic legislation. So it's a little bit of a balance, and I think we've achieved a good balance there, and we've also included in the language to accommodate our legislation, which, including the DSA, does sometimes could potentially require access to different, understanding, if you like, a little bit of how a online service works. So I think that's an important balance that we've made. I'm seeing another question about to what extent was the GDPR successful in ensuring EU data sovereignty? Well, I think the GDPR is very successful in achieving its objective, which is the protection of personal data. And just to be completely clear, what the GDPR doesn't do is, prevent any movement of personal data outside the EU. The GDPR has mechanisms that allow for the transfer of personal data outside the EU, but obviously subject to conditions to ensure the protection of that data, the integrity of that data. And I think that's very important. I think from our perspective, sorry, I was just thinking there was another angle to that. Yes, no, just to clarify a little bit, possibly, that in the context of our rules here, we don't distinguish, if you like, between, in our rules on prohibition of data localization, we don't distinguish, if you like, between non-personal data and personal data, but then we exclude the protection of personal data from the scope. So just to be completely clear. Question about what might happen if the GDPR is revised isn't really, if you like, pertinent in this context here, because as I said, GDPR is really a separate track and the protection of personal data is really on a separate track. So thank you for that. Right, so maybe moving to the next slide. So, unless maybe it's a moment to ask if people have additional questions specifically on our disciplines and on our provisions, because otherwise I'll move a little bit to explaining a bit more about how we approach digital trade in the WTO. Equally, don't worry if questions don't come to you right now, because I could also, I'm sure we'll have a bit of time at the end to address any further questions that may come up. Great. So quickly then, just to give a little bit of an overview, I mentioned previously, and I've gone into some of this before, but of course, at the WTO on a multilateral level, we do have both the multilateral moratorium on customs duties, electronic transmissions, and an e-commerce agreement that has been negotiated, but not amongst all WTO members, but rather it was negotiated amongst 91 WTO members. So maybe if we move to the next slide, I'll just explain a little bit more about the work program, electronic commerce, and the multilateral moratorium. So the moratorium on customs duties was adopted in 1998 by the actually by the General Council. I'm reading here. I thought it was a ministerial conference, but okay, it's renewed by every ministerial conference at the WTO since 1998. And it did two things. It created a work program on electronic commerce. And the work program electronic commerce is interesting because it is the place at the WTO where digital trade is discussed. It's a little bit the place where start the relationship between the existing WTO agreements, the pre-existing WTO agreements, for instance, the TRIPS agreement, and electronic commerce are the intersection, if you like, of those are discussed. I should clarify here that when the WTO talks about e-commerce, it actually means digital trade. It's not the subset, because it's often misunderstood to be purely, purchasing goods online. It's not. It's actually just a term, an old term that's used, but these days it basically means digital trade. So the idea, if you like, the way the work program has developed since 1998 has been, as I said, to discuss the impact of the intersection of WTO agreements and digital trade. But it's also had a focus in recent years very much on how we can facilitate the participation of all members, and particularly developing countries, in the digital economy. And so we've very much had exchanges relating to addressing the concerns or the needs and the sort of development requirements, if you like, of developing countries in order to facilitate participation in the digital economy. I'm afraid I can see that the slides have gone blank. I don't know if you...
Are they back now? They should be.
Not that I can see.
Okay.
Unless it's my computer playing up again. well, not to worry. I'll just keep talking a little bit about that. So just to say, I think the work program electronic commerce is interesting because it's very much the place in which digital trade issues are. Oh, here we go. Thanks very much. It's very much the place in which digital trade issues are discussed at the WTO, including increasingly recently artificial intelligence. So you may be aware the WTO Secretariat has put out a couple of interesting reports on the impact of artificial intelligence on digital trade. So that's something which I think is something that the WTO seems keen to take forward, and I think very, very important because it obviously affects. I'm getting a question about digital trade versus e-commerce. Yes, so I think, sorry, I thought I explained that, but maybe the question, there's a lag with the questions, but essentially electronic commerce as used at the WTO is essentially digital trade. I think initially it came probably from the fact that back in 1998, people weren't really envisaging quite as much the development of digitally delivered services as we see nowadays. But digital trade is very much the same thing as electronic commerce in this context. So the work programme has been renewed every 2 years by the Ministerial Conference at the same time as the moratorium on customs duties and electronic transmissions. Maybe if you move to the next slide. Great. So what does a moratorium do? As I said, I think it's pretty much foundational in terms of, facilitating the development of digital trade in general. So what does it do? It keeps the internet duty free. The term electronic transmissions may be mystifying some of you. And indeed, I think it's a little bit deliberately non-specific because it's really allowed us to cover different, maybe I should say first, to be clear, and some countries have suggested this, that electronic transmissions in this context only means the vehicle for transmitting electronically. I think the general consensus is, and it's absolutely clear, that when we talk about electronic transmissions in this context, we mean the content. So we're talking about software or data or digital content that's delivered online. So to be absolutely clear, and it's very important that it covers content. The impact of the moratorium, I think, has really been to support innovation and to support access to digital services for consumers and businesses worldwide. And so to that extent, it benefits both consumers and businesses. It allows consumers to access digital services more cheaply, right? But it also allows businesses to participate in and to sort of reach out to their domestic markets much more easily than they would otherwise. So it's really served to ensure that barriers aren't brought up, and it's really allowed a lot of, I'm thinking, for instance, of, say, a small software developer in a developing country. I mean, we heard examples at the WTO, very interesting recently, of, for instance, video games developers in the Caribbean. With the moratorium on custom duty and electronic transmissions, it's possible for a small software developer to participate in a global value chain and take their business forward in a way that just wouldn't be possible if we had barriers there. So I think that's incredibly important. So moving to the next slide. So the e-commerce agreement. So I'm now calling it the e-commerce agreement or the ECA. Until very recently, it was referred to as the Joint Statement Initiative on Electronic Commerce. And that's because it's a form of plurilateral agreement that is concluded not by all WTO members, but by those WTO members who are interested and willing. And the idea was to sort of set out a baseline of digital trade disciplines, very much along the lines that I've described, our EU digital trade disciplines, but obviously with adjustments because of the broader nature, if you like, of the potential participants. And these negotiations really took place from 1999. Sorry. 2019 to July 2024, when the negotiations were concluded. I think it's really very important for the WTO because it's something, you know, that is forward-looking, and it seems very important to us to ensure that this e-commerce agreement can be taken forward in the context of the WTO. However, it is a plurilateral agreement. There is quite a lot of controversy surrounding plurilateral agreements in the context of the WTO. Not all members are in favour of plurilateral agreements. Some members take the view that any agreement within the WTO ought to be all members, so all or nothing. And there's also been sort of adjustments to the scope of the agreement. The US, in fact, withdrew from the negotiations prior to them ending. And with that withdrawal, the scope of the agreement has been reduced. So it no longer includes all of the provisions that I described earlier. And of the sort of trade, the rules regarding the removal of trade barriers, it no longer includes disciplines on data flows or source code. But it does include a commitment regarding customs duties and electronic transmissions. And I think that's extremely important. And it also includes some very important disciplines regarding digital trade facilitation. So maybe if you just move to the next slide, we can have a quick overview of what it is there. And in the WTO e-commerce agreement, we've got here a number of provisions that you'll recognise from some of the things that I've described. And again, it's got an additional feature which I think is a top up to the telecoms reference paper that was agreed at the WTO. So the aim is to implement this as an Annex 4 agreement. So a plurilateral agreement which is integrated into the WTO legal framework. In this context, it's probably important to mention that the idea is that there should be a development package, which you know, for the number of developing countries, are been party to the negotiations. And obviously, we hope that a number of many countries will be joining this plurilateral agreement. But to ensure that these countries are able to, if you like, meet the commitments regarding the provision of online consumer protection rules, rules on electronic invoicing, electronic contracts, electronic authentications. Obviously, what's useful is to have a development package to include capacity building assistance, technical and capacity building assistance, in order to help countries take that forward. So moving on to the next slide, which I think is just a quick summary of the issues overall, which is to say, I think digital trade facilitation, generally speaking, improves efficiency and decreases costs for goods and services trade. And obviously, the concern is that barriers to digital trade can cause economic harm. And we're seeing maybe a rise of moves to sort of protect, which is of concern. And then finally, you know, a lot of the aim of what we're doing is to ensure that consumers are able to engage in digital trade with a sufficient level of trust. And I think that's very important. So with that, I think my presentation is concluded, and I'm obviously here and open for any questions that you may have.
Okay, I'm also checking the chat. I don't see any new questions. But in case those of you are still listening, of course, this is the time to do so. Nothing popping up for now.
Okay, I can only assume that it was all completely clear, and I do apologise about the technical hitch at the beginning. We did practice before, but something went wrong with my computer setup, clearly, because because it should have all been very smooth, and it wasn't. So I can only apologize. I think something similar happened to Steve Jobs, so that's all I'm saying. I don't know.
Well connected. I think we might have one last final question. I can put it in the chat for you.
New plans for digital trade agreements. No, this is a great question. So I mentioned the sort of the most recently opened free trade negotiations that we do have ongoing. That was Malaysia and UAE, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of digital trade agreements, I think it's been announced that we are looking into the possibility of a digital trade agreement with Canada, which is very exciting. I mean, I think if you look at the areas that we've looked at, there's obviously been in recent years a little bit of a sort of focus on Southeast Asia regions. And I think that's been quite interesting. That reflected sort of, the EU policy, and also reflects, of course, the growing importance of countries in that region with regard to digital issues and digitalization. So there I'm thinking in particular of Singapore and Korea, which are, of course, at the forefront, if you like, of digital everything. And then I think another thing that's been discussed a little bit in the press, I saw an announcement, a reference yesterday by the Minister of Singapore regarding possible cooperation between the EU and ASEAN. And I think Ursula von der Leyen talked about the possibility of cooperation more generally between the EU and CPTPP countries. Because obviously in the current trade climate, if you like, people are looking at all these different possibilities for cooperation. I think what's interesting there, and what I probably ought to clarify, and apologies because I probably didn't really go into this sufficiently as we went along, which is to say that, I've talked about free trade agreements, digital trade agreements, multilateral, plurilateral commitments. But I think the other thing that's important to know is that we do have other forms of digital trade engagement with countries. So, for instance, the digital trade agreements with Singapore and Korea actually arose out of the digital partnerships concluded by DG Connect with those countries. And one component of those digital partnerships were digital trade principles, non-binding digital trade principles, which were then converted, if you like, into digital trade agreements. So that was a little bit the evolution towards self-standing digital trade agreements with those countries. And so digital trade principles is certainly another tool. Another tool is engagement, if you like, on digital tools in the context of our trade dialogues, which we have with a number of countries worldwide. In our looking much more broadly in our economic partnership agreements, which are of course very broad agreements between the EU and many countries worldwide, we often have not an e-commerce chapter or a digital trade chapter, but we do typically have an article on cooperation on digital issues. And that can be grounds for having discussions, for instance, on digital tools. So we in the EU have my colleagues in DG Connect have obviously worked very hard on development of digital tools that facilitate trade. And this is the sort of thing which we can discuss with our partners worldwide. So that's another way, if you like, through either DG Connect's dialogues or through our trade dialogues, of really bringing our experience of developing these tools that facilitate digital trade to, I would say, bigger audiences, more countries worldwide. Yeah, and I think I mentioned ASEAN. I think the Singapore minister mentioned yesterday that he was looking into cooperation with the EU on digital trade issues. I'm not sure it's quite, yeah. So, all right, so I'm getting a question there about China and the high surge of low value goods into the EU. Yeah, so the thing about China is that you'll be aware that not just China, but we in the EU issued a communication in February of this year regarding electronic commerce, sort of business to consumer sales, if you have cross-border business to consumer sales into the EU. And obviously it's true that the number of these online players are from China. So the focus really of this communication is looking into the tools that we have to ensure compliance of products which come into the EU with our EU rules regarding product safety and the need to ensure compliance with those, which of course is somewhat difficult when you have a large volume of parcels coming in, which go direct to consumers. So very much that communications, which I encourage you to have a look at, is really looking into the different routes for ensuring that we can achieve compliance as best as possible with our internal EU rules. Then I'm getting some questions here. Ooh, who is the most important digital partner? Well, I mean, that's difficult to say, isn't it? I think all partners worldwide are very important digitally. And I'm probably not best placed to sort of identify that. Is the EU focusing on a multi-country digital approach? Well, I mean, I think probably what you're seeing is what I've described, which is effectively, yes, I would say that we're looking into cooperation with many countries worldwide. And then there's a question about Mercosur. Yeah, so the thing about the Mercosur agreement is, in fact, it was negotiated prior to the development of our digital trade chapter. So hence why that agreement in itself doesn't have the developed digital trade chapter that we see in agreements that were negotiated later. So that's an explanation of that. So I'm not sure that the EU-US discussions regarding digital policies are necessarily impacting our digital agreements. I think as I've described, our chapter very much, our EU digital trade chapters, and indeed, the WTO, for instance, digital trade e-commerce agreement very much accommodates, if you like, the need for regulation in different jurisdictions. And then I'm getting a question on the e-commerce communication. So I'm going to question on e-commerce communications. There's a mention of possible trade influence and what are the concrete plans? Well, I mean, it's really not for me to say. As you say, there is a mention of that. I think I couldn't know exactly how it's formulated, but essentially that, if the evidence is there, obviously the Commission will take things forward. But I'm not really in a position to say any more than that. I should also say that obviously e-commerce communication is really about goods. So I'm very much on the digital trade side. So while it has a word e-commerce because it's digitally enabled, if you like, the ordering, obviously the actual delivery is very much an issue for goods. So that's probably a little bit of a different sector there. Finally, if the WTO decided in future to apply customs duties on e-commerce, could it be done technically? Well, that's a very good question. I think it would be very difficult. I think what we saw was there's only one country worldwide that I think has introduced legislation to that effect, is Indonesia. And the way they did it was that they didn't actually impose the customs duties. They set the level at 0. But what they did in order to make it possible, if you like, in their legislation, is they actually had a notification system. So I don't know the details, but my understanding is that under their legislation, anybody buying digital services online has to notify that purchase to the authorities, so that I suppose customs duties could technically be calculated on that. Now, I don't know exactly how that's done, but basically the important thing to know is that, it seems to be based on a notification system. So it requires the purchaser, I think, because I guess the vendor would be outside the country, so the purchaser within the country would have to actually inform about the purchase. So I think that suggests that it would actually be very difficult to implement in practice. Well, so I flagged the final question here is about what about the OECD and the work that's done there? What are the relevant instruments? Well, so the OECD has done does a lot of work on digital trade, which is extremely interesting. I do encourage you to have a look. I've mentioned a couple of their reports, but they've done a lot of very useful work, including also on the impact of customs duties, electronic transmissions, and the risks linked to that. The IMF has done some very interesting work also on the what we see as a better alternative, which is value-added tax, non-discriminatory internal taxation, such as value-added tax or goods and services taxes. In terms of the OECD's instruments, there's none that I'm aware of that are strictly related to what I've been talking about here. There's obviously discussion at the OECD on digital taxation, but that's a little bit of a different side to things.
All right. Then I think we can wrap up here, if this is also okay with you, unless you have any closing remarks for our audience.
No, I was just to say thank you very much for your engagement and thank you for the excellent questions. It's always good to know that people are, really getting stuck in and thinking about these issues. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, Alex.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you as well, Monica, for the efforts. We know the questions are tough sometimes in the sense that they are very detailed or very expert driven. So thank you for your insights. I think it helps to see such exercises. And for those of you at home, I did mention as well, so the recording will stay on YouTube. The slides will appear on Futurium, and for EC colleagues, you can always find the recording and the presentation slides on our Connect University page on our intranet. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, and hope to see you at the following sessions as well. The next one being on the global gateway and supporting the digital transformation later on today in the afternoon from 2. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon ahead, everyone.